I mean, people who are kind and open and vulnerable are very courageous. Like it takes strength to be that. Like it's the opposite of weakness.
Yeah. Completely agree. Yeah.
Going into situations where you don't give a shit what people think about you. You know, you do what you feel needs to be done, and you do it. And people always, just about always, respond to it.
It's very brightly colored and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barger, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095. I was just looking up because we obviously reconnected recently and I couldn't remember when we first met, so I just looked it up. It was 15 years ago, actually. I was like almost to the date in November, so 15 years in November. When I was down in Bundanoon. So, yeah.
How did you track that down?
I just went onto Facebook and I looked at the photos of when I visited the monastery down there, and I must have put so I was probably there in around October, and then the photos were like 2nd of November, 15 years ago.
I would have been 62 then.
So you are 77.
Yeah.
Looking good. Well, yeah, we'll get into all that. I mean, you've obviously had a pretty challenging couple of years in many ways, but you're definitely looking good for 77. Maybe as a good starting point, because obviously we know each other and, no one at this stage knows you, and we're going to get into some of the stuff you do and what you're all about. But maybe just to give a bit of an intro of Paddy, and 77-year life so far is a long intro, but just a high level of the stuff you do in context of what we're going to talk about and where you're from and stuff.
Yeah, well, I started life in Sydney, sort of, I suppose, upper middle class suburb. Had one of those pretty golden childhoods because post World War II was our golden era, was a swimmer, a champion swimmer. My dad dragged me out of bed every morning at 5:30 and took me down swimming. So that sort of, in a way, a bit shaped my life, as a sort of swimming's a very solo performance, I suppose, like running,
Yeah.
and winning and discipline. So, yeah, in a way, I'm still swimming and still focused on winning. I went, I had a crazy Catholic childhood, getting flogged regularly and caned as they used to in those days.
Things have changed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, looking back, I would have been called ADHD,
Yeah, right.
I was a pain in the ass for teachers, very bright and get bored easily.
Same as. Yeah.
Just a disaster. Went to uni and did economics and market research, only because I really didn't know what else to do. So I ended up as a consultant in, I suppose, industrial market research, urban research. And then my dad died when I was 28, which was a very significant episode for me. And I saw that he'd been, had a very successful public service career, and he sort of died friendless, and I looked at myself and, I was successful in what I was doing, and I looked ahead and I saw Fat 50 and owning a yacht, and I thought, I'm out of here, So I sort of went bush, like to explore life laterally. Learned blacksmithing, welding, rural contracting. And I really enjoyed that, just mixing with people. And then I did my back in, lifting too many logs on cold mornings. And that led to a change of career in that I, couldn't do manual work for a while, did a lot of massage and acupuncture and took up yoga. And I also started working, we had a lot of unemployment at the time. There was a big recession. I started working with unemployed people as a grassroots sort of political guy. And I ended up setting up a really big homeless men's accommodation set up in an old migrant hostel in Canberra. That was pretty amazing, like dealing with 200 guys from all round, guys who from Second World War had come to Australia from Europe, mainly the Slavic countries, to work on the Snowy Mountains hydro scheme. And as older men, they were in our homeless persons camp, and we had drunks and drug addicts, people with mental health disabilities, women the women's refuges couldn't handle, people from the Lebanese civil war. It was sort of always high drama. We only had one policy, and that was no violence. We weren't there to rehabilitate anyone. It was just to offer them a comfortable little room and a bed, clean ablution facilities. And we had, the migrant hostel had a big kitchen, so we had a sort of a socially active cook, and we fed people. We really looked after them. And we let them basically do their own thing, except violence, and had a lot of police interactions. I mean, the police were very used to treating poor people like shit, and we put a stop to that. That was sort of an interesting dynamic. But we did that, and we had guns and knives and all sorts of stuff. I remember one incident where a guy we knew, who was a resident, he got drunk and got very upset at his girlfriend, and he had a .22 rifle, and he was screaming and yelling. And my partner at the time wanted to call the police, and I said, no, don't call the police. I'm fine with it. I'll just go in and talk to him. Anyhow, he called the police, and I heard the sirens. Mm. So I said to the guy, you better get out of here, So he went and hid in a ditch not too far away, and the police turned up, guns on the bonnets and everything else. And I thought, someone's going to get killed here. So I just walked out in front of the police and said, guys, look, I can get him to come out, hands in the air. There's no need for any guns, So I asked him to come out, and put his hands up in the air, explaining that the police had guns. And he came out with his hands in the air, and the police took him away. I mean, they beat him up in the cells, but...
Yeah, right.
So I did that for 3 years, and pretty well was burnt out after that time because it was pretty intense. And I realised later in life that it was really like having been in a war zone. And it was hard for me to fit into normal society. It was such a brutally rich environment and honest that you really couldn't explain it to other people. And that level of honesty and everything else.
You were doing that like a full-time gig for the 3 years, so you were completely immersed in it, essentially, with all of that kind of trauma. And makes a lot of sense then why it would have been like that. So yeah.
And it was an honest engagement with humanity as it was. Like those guys had very few masks anymore. So after that, I sort of pursued a career in that sort of social welfare, but private projects. And I had become keen on yoga. I took it up. My back got better. And I wanted to do something to maintain that. And I took on yoga, and then the whole spiritual aspect of yoga started to flower for me, like in the massage.
This
And
is
that,
when, just in terms of a time check here. So what kind of age are we talking now?
well, I started the Homeless Project in late 79,
Yep.
and I'd had the massage prior to that. So the massage had sort of awakened a whole lot of energies in me that I was just unfamiliar with, but liked.
Yep.
And spirituality meant nothing to me because I'd been brought up in a Catholic system that I thought was totally hypocritical bullshit, you know. So through the yoga, I got in touch with a whole aspect of spirituality that was totally different and totally new. And it didn't really have any rules, you know. It was just exploring a whole lot of philosophical and metaphysical stuff that I really enjoyed.
So it's interesting that. So did you pursue yoga because of your back issue? Because you know, for me, you're talking like maybe early 80s or something like that, roughly. Let's say.
Yeah.
I mean, these days a guy goes and does yoga. Yoga's everywhere, doesn't it? But early 80s, yoga was not everywhere. I imagine in Australia it was. I don't imagine it was a prevalent kind of practice in everyday society. So for a kind of bloke in his whatever you were in your 40s, roughly,
35.
to kind of start doing yoga would have been somewhat out of the norm at the time, right? That's my perception of it. And did you find it because of your back issue initially, but then discovered a very different side of it through the practice?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I've got to do something to look after my back, and I'd met a woman who was a Swami. You know, there was this ashram in outer Sydney called Satchinanda Ashram, which was booming because yoga had just sort of started to take off. And I met this woman, and she ran yoga classes, and I got involved with Satchinanda Ashram. So my rest and recreation was to go to the ashram and hang out, just to rest. And I also had learnt massage, and I wanted to study counselling, to sort of with the yoga, massage, and counselling. So I did 2-year postgraduate course in counselling at the University of Canberra, which I thoroughly enjoyed. You know, we had psychodrama, body therapy.
What is psychodrama? If I don't know, definitely the audience doesn't. I've never. It sounds like some sort of performance art, but I'm sure it's not.
Well, it's turning one's emotional reality into drama and using the dramatic mechanism.
Oh,
as
it
a
is.
way
Okay.
of,
So it is what it sounds like. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's psychological drama. And yeah, when I was doing that, I came in contact, I don't know, I mean, these things just happen. It's someone who was looking for someone to do trauma counselling, mainly around prison work, as a contractor. And I hadn't finished my counselling degree at the time, but they couldn't get anyone else. So I became a trauma counsellor, mainly with prisons, but armed hold-ups in supermarkets and banks and all that sort of stuff. But I dealt mainly with the Goulburn maximum security prison.
So as in there's a hold up, and then you're the counsellor for the people who are involved in that hold up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in prisons, it was working for the warders, like they'd have a hostage situation or an assault or suicide, or a riot. And I'd come in and do the counselling with the guys involved.
So that I mean, there's so much to kind of unpack here, and I know you haven't even finished, but it's interesting. And as you're talking, I'm just having thoughts. But obviously, that 3 years in that homeless shelter, I imagine, yeah, you do your counselling course and you get your certificate. But I would imagine the 3 years you did in the homeless shelter would have been incredible, kind of a great foundation for that type of work, as much as the training itself, the kind of on-site reality of dealing with trauma and everything else.
Yeah, look, it gave me a direct connection to sort of the guts and soul of the men.
Yeah.
Like the reality of it, and engaging with the person at that level is something you don't learn in a counselling program.
Yeah, right.
So, and the counselling program, I think had 26 women and 4 men. And counselling in that middle class sense is a feminine concept, So dealing with men, is a sort of is different, and in prison and drama, extraordinary. I remember one guy in particular, a young warder, who'd gone into a cell where a prisoner had hung himself, but he was still just alive, and he was holding him up to take the pressure off the noose. And he eventually got him down, and he died, in his arms, and he was pretty disturbed by it. And I was just working with him, and I'd remembered in reading a book by a Jesuit priest, Teilhard de Chardin, who was a mystic. And there was a phrase in that where he said, "I saw Christ in the eyes of a dying soldier." And that really hooked into me. And it came back, and I thought, this warder may have been looking into the eyes of the prisoner as he died, And that, would have been a explosive sort of experience for him. So when I next spoke to him, I said to him, "Did you look into the prisoner's eyes as he was dying?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Pretty powerful experience, hey?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was able to, I talked about Teilhard de Chardin. I talked about, the soul of a guy leaving, the impact on him, and how if one wasn't aware of the energy of what had happened, it would be very disturbing. He got better, So after that, I did some drug and alcohol counselling with prisoners, and I remember doing a yoga class with the prisoners where I did yoga, and then I did yoga nidra, which is a powerful relaxation program, and then meditation. And the prisoners were absolutely stoked, and they just said more.
Yeah.
And of course, all the schedules changed in the prison, and I couldn't do it. And I thought, if I ever get the chance again, I'll do something like that. And the monastery where you and I met, Santee, one day I was there and the abbot said, does anyone want to be a Buddhist prison chaplain in Goulburn? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I did just a security training program. And then for 6 years, 1 day a week, I turned up and did meditation with prisoners and discussion groups afterwards. You know.
So at this point, I mean, this is getting into some of the stuff I really want to chat about. And so you are practicing and you're practicing yoga, you're a counselor, you're working, counseling around trauma, you're in the prisons, or you've been in the prisons. You're then visiting a monastery, I imagine just on a kind of casual basis once a week and seeing who's in there, like when you and I met. So when you went into Goulburn, were you going in with a foundation of yoga, or at that point had you, kind of been involved with Buddhism a lot more? And we'll talk about the similarities of the two, which I know for me, many people don't really understand. They see yoga as this, kind of practice in the gym, and yoga as this religion over here. And we'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, where were you at in terms of your own journey with understanding Buddhism? And when I say understanding, I mean, I suppose, the practice side. Were you just being exposed to it and yoga was really the foundation you were going in with, and then you had this kind of, hey, I'm the Buddhist chaplain, or had you been involved in Buddhism for quite some time?
I remember talking with the abbot, Bhante Sujato, whom you had met.
Yep.
About it. And I wasn't a very academic, card-carrying Buddhist. For me it was experiential, meditation, love and kindness, and learning to let go. Just, it was simple shit, And I'd coined the phrase bush Buddhism, like simple stuff,
Yeah.
And Sujato said to me, I remember it, he said, "Oh, you're a bit feral." He said, I don't think I can tell you much.
Well, he's probably the most academic Buddhist monk out there in the Theravadan tradition, if you'd want to say it like that. But anyway, sorry, I'll let you finish your story. But yeah.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I went in just wanting to do I just wanted to nurture the prisoners and introduce them to I suppose a way of being that would bring them more equanimity in their time in jail.
Yeah.
And for them to feel that someone cared for them. So just doing a love and kindness meditation, and then just basically, holding a men's group with a spiritual aspect to it.
Yeah.
And then I got to do some work with Indigenous prisoners. And that was pretty powerful, because it started off with me interpreting one of the guy's dreams. And he said to his mates, he said, "Hey, this fella, he can tell you about your dreams. Come along."
That's a good in.
So we'd come along and we'd talk about totems and tribes, and I used to do guided meditations with them.
Yeah.
That were shamanic with a indigenous flavour. And they just thrived, They just loved it. Yeah.
And what was the yoga piece that, when you taught yoga in there, from what angle were you coming with that? I mean, was it, hey, here's a way to kind of limber up your body and keep your joints good? Or was it, hey, here's a way to understand your mind and follow your breath, because those two elements are kind of what makes it up, but people look at it in different ways.
Look, I did nothing and none of that. I just said to the prisoners, I think I had them in a group for something or other.
Yeah.
And I just said, hey guys, I want to run a yoga class. Are you interested? And they said, yeah, that's cool. And I think they said, what is it? And I said, oh, look, just turn up and we'll do it,
Yeah.
And we did, we started off doing some asanas or exercises. Then it moved into the yoga nidra, which is a very powerful relaxation technique. And then a meditation. So it was experiential.
Yeah.
And with those sort of guys, like prisoners and homeless people have got the most well-developed bullshit detectors of anybody. So the less words and the more experience, the better.
Yeah.
And they just loved it because it was an experience that, they loved.
Awesome. You make me think have you seen the film Dharma Brothers, by the way? It's a pretty old, it's a documentary. It's old now, but just came to mind as you're chatting. It was about, I forget the guy's name. He ran a Vipassana in a high security prison in, I think, Alabama. Anyway, one of the kind of Bible Belt areas of the US, and had massive breakthroughs with full on crazy kind of prisons. I use that word in the sense of the things they'd done. One guy had shot someone kind of 50 times or something, but they had huge breakthroughs. And then unfortunately there was a big uproar in the Christian community because people were getting better. they didn't believe it, because these prisoners were having these kind of awakening moments as they reflected after sitting for 10 days, which is a long time to sit. They did it in a big hall in the prison. It's fascinating, but it was a real shame. I mean, it's a documentary from about 15 years ago, I think, and it's a real shame because there was a big backlash in the Christian community locally, who were like, hey, no, these people need to kind of be punished, and not, if they're saying they're better, they're not better. You need to kind of lock them down harder. And I don't know, you wouldn't have had to deal with that in the place you were doing it. But did you have any breakthroughs with people in terms of, that process of whether it's yoga or meditation, just self-reflection and, the kind of healing of that?
Look, it's people look forward to it. I suppose stories tell things. There was one guy who was sort of from high society in there, for accusation of having thrown his lover off the Gap in Sydney.
Oh, I
and
remember.
Killed her.
Actually, or maybe you told me this story. I remember that story because it was fairly public, right, in terms of the case. Yeah.
Yeah, so he did maybe 6 years in Goulburn, and he used to come along to my classes. And he eventually had a massive legal appeal, and he got he was declared innocent. And he came to visit me afterwards, where I lived in Bundanoon. And we had a chat, and as he left, he said, he thanked me for being there. He said, because it sort of pretty well kept him alive.
Wow.
And he started crying, And I gave him a hug and he went off, So that's the sort of thing,
Yeah.
And I work with, Christian chaplains, a Muslim chaplain. We had a ultra high security unit there with Muslim terrorists.
Yeah.
And I used to go in and work with them with the Muslim chaplain, and there was no conflict between us as chaplains.
Yeah.
Just we were there to help the prisoners.
Yeah, I think maybe that Dharma Brothers documentary is probably quite an extreme version. I know in Singapore I was exposed to the prison a little bit, and it was, yeah, there was a lot of collaboration. In fact, there was a whole process of driving collaboration between the different faiths and stuff. So, yeah, Ajahn Chah. Let's talk about Ajahn Chah a little. I mean, many people, unless they understand Buddhism and Thai forest Buddhism, obviously I'm in Thailand, you know, many people won't know who Ajahn Chah is, but I know for you, and you know, we just talked about a monk that was at Santi and, you know, practiced under Ajahn Chah or Ajahn Brahm, but under Ajahn Chah's lineage.
Ajahn Chah.
Yeah. How did you come into kind of contact with the whole Ajahn Chah lineage, and why did it resonate? Why does it resonate so much with you?
Look, I met a couple of young monks, I think Australian, English, and we were chatting, and they explained their training with Ajahn Chah in Thailand, you know, as a forest monk. And I really liked the guys, I didn't really like cultural Buddhism and intellectual Buddhism. And these guys seem to be quite different, very down to earth, very basic. So I started basically reading Ajahn Chah's stuff. And it was all written by other monks, because Ajahn Chah didn't speak English. So they'd translate and write them up. And he was just such a straight shooter and down to earth sort of a guy. It just resonated with me.
Yeah, same.
And, you know, he'd say crazy shit like, finding a tortoise with a moustache is difficult, so it is finding peace. When the conditions in your heart are right, peace will find you. You know, like just stuff like that. And I'd go, yeah, I get that, you know. So he was an inspiration. The total opposite of hypocritical, rule-based spirituality.
Yeah. That piece for me, and actually not just him, but I think that kind of core of which he is, but that the Thai forest tradition, which you don't see it in Thailand, you don't see it. You have to go and find it. You know, there's a lot of, obviously Buddhism is everywhere here. There's a very kind of community-based Buddhism, like our local monastery at the end of, or temple at the end of the road here. You know, the monks are great, but one of them's having a ciggy and the other one's doing the garden, and then they're always there to help. It's like it's very different to then you go to there's a Thai forest monastery, I think, on the way to Mae Hong Son, which then is completely different. But that, for me, it's that back to basics of, it's just, hey, you know, kind of do this, this and this, sit down, follow your breath, you know, things will happen. That kind of real, you know, forget all the rituals and all the, you know, you have to do this, and just, you know, just have a go and see what happens. It's very enticing in that way. And I can see why many Westerners it would have been the 70s, right? 60s, I suppose, when Ajahn Sumedho, I don't know when the first monk, he was the first, I think, Western monk that ended up at Wat Pa Pong. But yeah, I can see why it was enticing to people in the 60s, 70s who were dedicated to that kind of path of meditation.
Yeah, well, the so-called Buddhist countries, most of it's cultural Buddhism.
Yeah.
You know, it's part of their culture, and it's part of the social glue that hangs them together, you know, as Christianity is in the Church of England, the Catholic Church in Italy, or Church of England in England. And Westerners weren't part of that culture, and cultural Buddhism didn't really interest them, but the high Buddhist philosophy did. And the only place they could get access to that was through the forest monks. And so that's where they went. I mean, I love the story that Ajahn Chah was discovered by Americans because his monastery was near a B-52 bomber base during the Vietnam War.
I've never heard that story, but interesting.
So the airmen, discovered Ajahn Chah, and that it became a network, a word of mouth.
Yeah.
Hey, look, there's this pretty cool monk, go and check him out, and so those people, went back home, and just the word got around.
Yeah, it's a kind of, I mean, it's still, there's still a pretty prevalent network of it, I would imagine, around the world, and obviously here, but I'm in Thailand, you don't hear about it much. You still have to go and hunt out the real kind of Thai forest monasteries, but there are many of them. You just got to kind of know where to find them, and they're different, like you say, to the cultural Buddhism that also exists here. It's quite different. It's two very different things,
Are there any near Pai where you are?
There's one there is one, from what I understand, I've not been to it. There's one on the way to Mae Hong Son, but I haven't actually even been. I mean, I've been to one. I went to the one where I think Semedo is now staying, which is in the south, which actually we may visit in a couple of weeks on our way back up after a trip. I forget the name of it. It's in Khao Yai. It's in the national park. It's a beautiful spot and they actually protect a lot of the national park around there in terms of the wildlife. And so the well-known ones are few and far between. Obviously, then you've got Wat Pa Pong up in Ubon Ratchathani and Nanachat. And I've never asked you, have you been to Thailand, actually?
No.
Oh, right, okay.
I mean, I'm looking forward to visiting for your wedding.
Yeah.
And I was thinking I'd like to catch up. But Wat Pa Pong, I mean, is quite a long way from Chiang Mai.
It's a trek. And I mean, as you know, I made a kind of very B-rate documentary after my experience in Santee, which was really fun. I just kind of ran around with the camera, and I always remember just turning up there with this bloody great, now everything's on, and you could have done it with an iPhone now. I had this thing that was like this size, and I just kind of turned up, and the monk was like, "What are you doing?" Then some Western monk come out and said, "Oh, what's going on?" Because the Thai monk, I explained, and they were like, "Okay, you can sit there for 20 minutes, and you can." Well, they said you can watch but don't film, but you said you can come out in the morning at 4:35 a.m. and follow us when we go around the local area. So, yeah, interesting. So I'm going to change tack before we go down the rabbit hole of Ajahn Chah. When I was looking at it's kind of linked. It's all linked anyway. But when I was looking at our the photos to work out when we first met, sorry, I have this great picture of you sitting in a coffin, of which it's a coffin table. I don't know if you still do these, and I'm sure some will not let me have one, but I love them. Can you tell us about your coffin tables? Do you do still? And then, I mean, this is probably a good segue to talk about all of this stuff that's linked to what's behind you as well. But let's start on coffin tables, because I thought it was such a great, quirky little business, if that's what it was. But yeah, tell us about coffin tables.
Well, its origin is really a childhood issue. When I was 11, my mother told me that she wanted to terminate me when she was pregnant. And for an 11-year-old, that was a trauma, and she said she didn't because my father wouldn't let her. And I remember saying to her, well, if I wasn't here, I wouldn't know about it. But that sort of exposure to death, happened quite young for me. And I remember when I was doing blacksmithing in the country, I had this image of creating a metal sculpture of a woman giving birth into a coffin.
Wow.
And
Pretty dark, pretty interesting.
yeah, it didn't feel dark.
It sounds dark as an explained concept, but beyond that, there's a lot of reality to it, obviously. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, to me it wasn't dark at all. It was just a perspective on life and a reality. And so years later, when I was in Bundanoon, I thought, I want to make a coffin. So I made a coffin and put it, into my lounge room, and called it the coffin table, and I used to walk past it on the way out, and I would imagine myself lying in the coffin, dead. And here I was alive, and I actually got quite comfortable with it, like I was okay being alive and I was okay being dead.
Yeah.
Like I like both versions of me.
Brilliant. Mate, it's such a taboo thing. It's very, very interesting. I know we talk a little bit about Sam Harris when we talk. It's just interesting because I know, because of his background, he thinks about death a lot. I do a lot. And I've said this to people and they almost like freak out when I say it. He ran a survey which really shocked him that it's such a small amount of the population that, think about it at all, which I found really surprising because it's an absolute inevitability. And I think, again, it goes back to Buddhism, really. I mean, there's a whole thing of, really facing it in that way is then you start to kind of live. But yeah, that's what I liked about your coffin tables. I mean, that's really kind of putting it right in the living room. But yeah,
Well, it's also part of existential therapy or existential philosophy. Is death anxiety is a major elephant in the room, and fear of death can cause all sorts of emotional problems. So I designed a workshop which I've run a few times, and I've called it Dancing with the Angel of Death.
Yeah, I remember this now. You've been doing this for a while, right? I remember you talking to Will and I about it, yeah.
Yeah, and the idea is that in order to dance with life, you need to dance with death. And I used to have arguments with my sister, who's a psychologist, because she was into positive psychology. And I said, look, you guys are like climbing up the ladder to the apple tree of happiness, but what's driving you is the Grim Reaper. You've got to turn around and dialogue with the Grim Reaper, like to hug the Grim Reaper, like to not be frightened. It's just part of our reality. And there's a certain level of authenticity and honesty about being human, that it gives you as a perspective that I think is very important. I had planned on doing a workshop, the Dancing with the Angel of Death, just as COVID hit, so we had to cancel it. But maybe next year I'll do one again.
And what's there, without necessarily going into the whole kind of format of the workshop, the objective for a participant there is to come out and be content with the understanding of well, getting rid of what you just called death anxiety, right? I think you just called it, which it's
Yeah,
not a
look,
term I'd heard, but
it's an experiential workshop where it's not intellectual. I mean, you just get engaged with death, the reality. So there are coffins, there are burials, there's meditations in the going to the cave of death, and accepting that we will die, and what do we want to let go of in our journey?
yeah,
How do we want to present at death? You know,
yeah,
when the Grim Reaper takes you to meet St. Peter at the pearly gates, and St. Peter said, "Well, what do you bring? Like, what do you say?" And it's a very intense, reflective point for people. Is to say, "Hey, I'm engaged with, fighting my present, but I will die. Who do I want to be? If I look back at my life, what would I have liked to have said? What would I have liked to have done? What I would like to have let go of?" And bringing all that into your life. That's what it's about. It's fun, like I enjoy it because it's very real. It's like dealing with the homeless men. It's like being in prison. It's
very interesting what you say. I'd not heard. I mean, like I say, yes, death is not typically a conversation you're having, over Saturday beers when I go and watch the rugby later. It's not something that just gets kind of thrown around the the bar or the restaurant table. But personally, I've always kind of tried to contemplate. But for me, actually, it's interesting what you say there, because I think the anxiety on a personal level for me is then not dealing with the, hey, you're going to die. It's then making sure that piece of, have you sorted everything out in a way that makes sense, and that you're parting in a which you see these stories all the time of people. I know someone locally actually who's maybe only got weeks left now. See him on my walk and I speak to him occasionally, and he seems quite at peace actually, and he's sorting loads of things out. And it seems odd to do that when you don't know, and everyone does it if they do know they're going to die. But for me, it's the anxiety of making sure that's all sorted out. I don't know whether that's a healthy anxiety because you're going, well, it's an inevitability, or other people will be like, oh, just don't think about it, so it doesn't matter. It's an interesting one. There's not really a question in there. I'm just kind of contemplating the the area of it. It's interesting.
Well, it's interesting for me, like at 77 and having just survived bowel cancer, and come out, clean. That was I suppose, a death awakening. And I mean, I'm a trained counsellor and a Buddhist, so I had a lot of internal mechanisms for facing that. So I thought, hey, how can I maximize my own growth through this? And basically, I thought, I just need to let go of everything, and I need to just surrender into the care of the people who'll be treating me.
Did you? So I was going to say,
And I did.
Yeah, and look, I mean, obviously, great to see that you are looking so well, and that you've been through that. It sounds like you just used your own support mechanisms, as in, the stuff you knew, and almost kind of were your own counselor. Is that how you kind of went through that process? And then you had all the people around you doing, looking after all the physical side of the process. But yeah.
Yeah, so, and I knew at the time that by letting go and surrendering, that I was allowing a new sort of self to emerge. And I mean, just recently, I've been thinking and discussing with a mate, in my men's group, the whole concept of relevance deprivation, like, am I still relevant? Am I still a man who can do things? I'm thinking, I wrote that manual on facilitating men's groups, which is, available internationally. And I'm thinking of, doing more with it, an audible version or an online course with video vignettes. And my mate said to me, "Still trying to be relevant, are you?"
I,
And I said, "Yeah, but I'm aware of that. That's the main thing.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm going to ask the people who've bought it, is there a need to do this? Because the last thing I want to do is do it through some sort of ego need.
Yeah, I mean, that what you said there is so key, right? The awareness of that. I mean, I'm obviously, you got a few years on me, but I think everyone thinks about relevance. I mean, I think we all do, but yeah, that awareness is important because you don't want to just go, I'll just be apathetic. I just won't do anything because it's not worth it because I'm not, there's this kind of, you still got to keep doing the things you love, but then the awareness of how that sits in terms of importance to the ego versus just self-satisfaction and giving something back. I mean, I think that awareness is so critical in that process.
Yeah, it brought to mind one of my favorite Buddhist sayings. There's a Zen darumas, which are ink sketches with a little saying. And there's one I came across, which is just a beautiful outline of the Buddha and some Japanese calligraphy by a monk, Nobutada, in the 16th century. And the calligraphy says, quietness and emptiness is enough to pass through life without error. And I really love that, but it's so hard.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's a lovely one end of a scale, to realize that we pass through life. We are just a speck, a flash, and that's the reality. And if we're going to focus on something or do something, have it add value to whoever. I think Aldous Huxley said that at the end of his life, and he'd done a lot of exploring with drugs and spiritual concepts. He said, at the end of all this, he said, there's only one thing that makes sense to me. And he says that the world could do with a lot more kindness. And, that's very much part of the Buddhist teachings, love and kindness. I mean, that doesn't mean being a wimp.
Yeah, well, this is part of the issue, right? Like,
You
the word kind has this kind of, from a male perspective, has this unfortunate kind of link to weakness, which I think it's this is just a language issue. I think personally, I mean, I think I think it's changing massively, but there is still that kind of, hey,
it's a cultural issue.
Yeah.
It's I mean, for me, in working in this space, I mean, people who are kind and open and vulnerable are very courageous. Like, it takes strength to be that. Like, it's the opposite of weakness.
Yeah. Completely agree. Yeah.
Going into situations where you don't give a shit what people think about you. You just, You do what you feel needs to be done, and you do it. And people always, just about always, respond to it.
Yeah. Indeed. Hey, look, we're on an hour. Are you okay for time?
Yep. I'm
Cool.
fine.
Let's just talk about. I mean, this is a good segue, and yeah, I mean, look, thanks for sharing everything so far. I want to talk about your men's group work in a bit more detail. This might be slightly off topic of what it is, but I would like to just ask your perception of, hey, you know what, when you look at the world today, I mean, I would not like to be a young man growing up today. I think it's really challenging. I know this is not really the focus of your men's group per se. I mean, your men's group, I think, if I'm not wrong, and I read your manual, and by the way, I think you should do a voice audio version of it, because your voice is particularly soothing and interesting, and I think it'll be great to hear it in an audio version. Your men's group, I know, not. Tell me if I'm wrong, actually, but they're not focused really on younger generations, or is it just anyone? And yeah, I get a sense that it's more with older men like myself. And my point was, yeah, you know, for you, what do you see challenges in being a kind of younger man growing up today? I mean, you know, I'm probably somewhat immersed in the world of technology and the internet, and you know, I see kind of where things are going and society-wise, but through that lens a little bit. And I just think I'd hate to be, you know, a lad growing up now. I think it would be very difficult. It seems to be not, you know, to your point of vulnerability, there's a lot of conversation around, hey, that's courage, that's strength. But at the same time, there don't seem to be the support networks for younger men growing up. Don't know, a lot in there, I know, but really want to kind of ask you about your men's group and get your perception on how you're seeing, you know, the male kind of situation in the world today.
Yeah, well, that's a huge question, and like young in men's group work, you know, is 50.
Yeah, right. Well, there you go. Okay, I was right then. Okay,
Um,
my age, 50,
so
round the corner for me, but next year.
yeah. And you know, just in the normal developmental pathways for people or men, you know, like those younger days are the striving days, you know, that warrior part of the hero's journey.
Yeah,
And death and wisdom and spirituality just aren't ingredients in that stew, you know, like
yeah,
they're. And I brought up my last boy on my own, you know, and he was exposed to all of my work and Buddhism and everything else. And he's now in the army. And just the exposure to his dad and, you know, integrity and philosophy and kindness, you know, just has shaped him as a man.
yeah,
You know, I mean, he's very much his own man, but those things are part of his life. And, you know, with the demise of, you know, the churches, I mean, the fastest growing religion is no religion. And, you know, so in a sense, we're moving into territory that is new and, in one way, is a moral vacuum.
yeah,
Integrity, ethics, kindness, you know, is not a capitalist product. It's not a high-tech product. If you look at our drama, it's really all about violence. So, Yeah, I mean, how does one? I think the only thing I feel I can do is continue to be a role model, and as an elder, hold the space for younger men and do things like, say, doing an audible of the facilitation manual, and to be able to show younger men something that they can look up to and feel safe with. That's about all I can do.
I mean, it sounds like a lot, so it's good on an individual level. So yeah, I mean, it's
But if older men, can be that for the younger men in their lives, that's the passing on. The one of the things that's missing, I noticed, like I listened to Sam Harris and Lex Friedman and all the whoopee-doo podcasters, including you.
okay. I'll take that, but yeah, I'm not quite sure I'm in that realm. But yeah, go on.
I know I'm just it's a very big medium, and younger men listen to it.
Yeah, for sure.
My son and I have brilliant conversations about Sam Harris, Lex Friedman, and Joe Rogan. And if you meet young school kids, or like end of their schooling, I was at a friend's house, and he had kids that were at the end of their schooling, and we started chatting about podcasts, and their father was just amazed that he was this older dude talking to his school kids about podcasts.
It's so important because it's long form. I mean, that for me is why it's so important, because everything else these days is just snippets and bullshit, really, and pushing products and everything. It's the only, for me personally, it's the only area where I can really work out what the hell's going on. It's because it's handy from that point of view.
And the thing that's came to me in sort of listening to someone, Lex was interviewing a psychologist, and I got a bit disturbed that he was sort of like collecting bits of spiritual technology from Buddhism and yoga and Taoism and intellectual tools. And Sam Harris is a bit like that, and this guy didn't sound like a wise, kind, compassionate man. He's so caught up in being clever and being with it and intelligent. I felt very much that particularly Buddhism or Christianity, in its higher sense, it is a way of being in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a wordless thing. Podcasts are, in fact, words.
Yeah.
In this case, we've got visuals as well. And I think, exploring more that sort of way of being in the world through storytelling, really. And I felt like, how do you contact people like Lex Friedman? Because, they've got millions of listeners and they've got firewalls, because otherwise they'd get flooded with communications. I feel like saying to Lex, hey man, why don't you get some really cool monks on or something who can talk about that way of being in the world,
Send him an email, drop him a video. People, the one great thing about you do get through to people these days. You can get through to some people. It's quite interesting. Not easy. Joe Rogan obviously is probably on a different level, and there's just too many kind of walls to get through. But yeah. Then again, what monk wants to jump on a podcast? That's the other problem. The Dalai Lama on the Tibetan side, there's they tend to be more engaged, kind of on in a media sense. So, kind of visually or vocally. But yeah, I know what you mean.
I mean, the only monk you'd want to get on a podcast is a monk who didn't want to be on a podcast.
Yeah.
You know, because I mean, some of the monks themselves are caught up in that being clever world. They become entertainers and intellectual and academic, and that's why I liked Ajahn Chah. He was never like that.
That's why, to be honest, when I met Ajahn Brahm, that's why, and the way that, Santi Ajahn, who was the Santi monk? Sujato, when he used to talk, because he was an intellectual guy, but I remember when he used to talk about Ajahn Brahm, he would talk about him with such respect in the fact that he just kind of seemed to joke around, and he's probably the one that's at his third jhana and all this stuff. But he's just the one kind of being very normal and joking around. And when he said that, it always stuck with me. That, and when I met Ajahn Brahm, I found him really fascinating in that way. His ability just to engage and give you absolutely everything. And then when his presence was so powerful, and then the moment you didn't need his presence, he was gone. And he was present. His presence was with someone else. It's very interesting, and there was no kind of boasting intellect or anything like that. He's all about funny stories, But obviously, packed in there is huge amounts of wisdom. It's the best way, I think, to communicate proper wisdom is through great stories, right? I mean, it's rather than intellectually trying to communicate it, because you just can't.
No, and for young men, to hear stories that they can get a grip on, engage with, that do talk about, the courage of integrity and ethics and kindness, that gets to them.
Yeah.
And that authenticity, it's a powerful energy.
It is. How do you, I mean, you just mentioned the fastest growing religion is no religion, which I kind of knew. And do you think, I mean, it seems to me there's probably a spiritual deficit in the world. On the same flip side, I do not like organized religion. So I kind of like the fact that there is this growing kind of non-religion, non-belief element. But would you agree there's probably a spiritual deficit? And do you think it's a good thing that is the fastest growing religion? And because I personally, I've never had good exposure to, I was christened. I grew up I went to a boarding school. I remember being asked, do you want to be confirmed? And just going, no, I can remember it. Absolutely. I'm like, I don't want any more of this stuff. So for me, I don't, the fact that religion is kind of breaking down in many ways, doesn't worry me. But I also agree there's probably a spiritual deficit in the world, right? And I hear people say that. Yeah, this kind of growing atheist, if you want to call it that label, do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a positive step, or do you think there needs to be a balance in terms of, the religious element to the world?
If you got any more easy questions? Look, I mean, I think spiritual organizations, are part of our evolution. They're the sort of the social glue for societies, and they perform a purpose. That's why they flourish and exist. And when they stop fulfilling a purpose, they cease to flourish.
Yeah.
So organized religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they're ceasing to be necessary as a social glue, because their technology was part of our evolution. And society in the last 100 years has gone through absolutely massive changes.
Yeah, hard for them to stay relevant in their own kind of life journey.
Yeah, but in a way too, the metaphysical aspects of those religions was always a rare commodity, you know, like Sufism in Islam, you know, was a sort of a mystical. I mean, the poet Rumi, Hafiz, and society is going through the sort of the melting pot, the chaos of reforming. And we do need, I suppose, to have some way of branding or owning qualities that are wholesome. And I don't know what that will be. There are, I mean, the socially progressive social justice stuff is in fact the new religious cult.
Yeah.
You know, it's the way people are. They're clinging to it as an identity and meaning, because it's no longer fashionable to be religious. But the function of meaning that religion provided to people in the past is still part of our need system. So we develop new belief systems that satisfy that need. So social justice in its extreme sense and social progressivism becomes a cult.
Yeah.
And
go on.
And I think that, you know, that's just as problematic as organized religion was. You only have to look at America in terms of the polarization and divisiveness. So I think, you know, a spiritual philosophy or some sort of reflective mechanism, and that's my interest in men's groups. For me, they're vehicles for self-development and developing I suppose, a more sophisticated, a higher grade of sort of reflection on living. That's my interest, and I'm open about that.
I'll get to two really simple questions as we close in a minute, but just a point on what you said, because it goes back to, I think, my question around masculinity, actual men. Yeah, that this whole kind of social justice thing. There's an expression. What is it? The path to hell was built with 1,000 good intentions, or whatever it is. I paraphrase.
The road to hell is the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
So for me, that is the expression that comes in my head when I think about this social justice movement, because I think it's dealing. When I go back to my question on being a young man, it's like there was a meme I saw going around last week which showed superheroes from 30 years ago and superheroes today, right? And superheroes at the top are all like this, and the ones at the bottom are all like have these completely different qualities, and that is all about that movement. The problem for me is that's not the right way to deal with, you know, introducing things like vulnerability. And you don't need to say, hey, you need to change your masculinity to be vulnerable. You need to embrace it and understand it and be vulnerable. I think a lot of the social justice movement deals with things in such an extreme way that it isn't progressive. It's actually regressive. And it's an interesting time. I agree with you on the cult element of it, hey? And unfortunately that often it's often good intention, bad outcome, you know? So hopefully it works itself out. We shall see. I got two questions, two really easy ones as we go close to an end.
Okay.
We haven't even talked about bread. How do you bake the perfect loaf of bread? And that's an opportunity to talk about your baking a little bit. When I met you in Bundanoon years ago, I think you even gave me some growing yeast for sourdough, and I loved your bread. I know you've just started doing it again. Tell us a bit about bread. That could be a whole other podcast, by the way, so we don't need to. We could do that another time. But it was that, and then after that, let's just quit. I should have opened up with this, but tell us about the stuff behind you, because it's pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's two last points: bread and rocks.
Yeah, look, when I was looking after my last boy, we're living in a stone hut in a forest, and I started baking bread, and my friends wanted more of it, and I had this shitty old little electric oven, and a friend, Manuel, who'd come from a Portuguese peasant farm, he offered to build me a wood-fired brick oven, and for nothing really. I supplied the materials, and I had a bakery, a wood-fired oven bakery, and I became a baker. And in that archetypal sense,
Yeah.
The old wood-fired oven, I had my own grain grinder, and I ran a bakery for 7 years and learnt sourdough baking at a time that was in the 1990s, and sourdough baking was in its very the resurgence of interest in sourdough baking was in its very early days. Anyhow, I finished the bakery up after 7 years and built my own house. And then I thought, what will I do with my baking skills? And I thought, people want to know about baking sourdough bread. So I used to run sourdough bread making courses. And then when I moved to Tasmania, where I am now, I built my kitchen to run small sourdough baking courses. And then COVID came, so I had 2 courses booked, and I will continue to do that. But I've been baking a bit for a local restaurant and getting up with more modern techniques. But it's just part of my life. I mean, I like baking bread. And
wasn't it one of the most popular kind of pastimes that just sprung up during lockdown? I think I read that. And my sister started baking. Loads of people started baking again. I had no idea why that was, but
it's something it was something you could do at home, and it was wholesome, and it was also a challenge. It became a status symbol. Like if you could bake really good sourdough bread, you were somebody, And it also became an Instagram phenomena.
Yeah, right.
Like people were baking bread that looked good, whereas as someone who's been a commercial baker and in supplying a local cafe, you produce bread that's good to eat that people can buy and use. So sure, it has to look good and everything else, but you don't have the time to sort of do the minutiae that the Instagram bakers do. And I'll be stopping supplying locally soon and just re-engaging with running sourdough bread making courses.
Cool.
Because I don't like the pressures of commercial baking. Like I like the alchemy, and I like exploring and trying different recipes. And I've got my own grinder, and there's a local organic grain grower who grows all this weird old-fashioned grains. I just love. It's just sort of like, playing for me.
Cool. Well, I will. For anyone who's watching, listening, I'll leave some links where people can find. You've got some areas where people can find out about this stuff, right? Your baking courses and.
I've got a Facebook. I've got a Facebook page.
Cool. Well, I will. I'll leave links to that, and I suppose as we kind of slow down. I should have started with this question, like I say, but the stuff behind you, there's a bunch of different rocks here. They look. Well, don't let me even try and guess. Let me talk. You don't need to talk through every rock, but can you give us a bit of a perspective on the different rocks? And actually, I know you've always loved rocks because you gave me one, and I have one still from 15 years ago. I don't know if you remember. You gave me a small rock when I left Bundanoon all those years ago. So, what is it about rocks, and what do these ones represent holistically or individually?
Well, I call them the wisdom stones, and they originally came from a river, the Churros River, in New South Wales in the middle of a huge forest. And I just enjoyed them, you know, and they were also near an Aboriginal sacred site. And I related to them, you know, they're millions of years old, you know, and I gave them the sort of the representational power of wisdom and spirit, you know. And I just collected them and had fun. I used to go into the forest and arrange them and take photos. And I suppose they represented trying to symbolize the mystery of living and life, you know. And I then started to use them in therapy as a way of people mapping out their life journey on a table.
Oh,
Like
cool.
I'd get them to select one for themselves and then select one for life and one for death, and then, you know, ask them questions about what was still impacting them from childhood and what their goals were, what the barriers were, and we'd create a sculpture on a table, you know, as a sort of a life journey sculpture from life to death. So
Cool.
and it's quite a powerful technique, because the people choosing the rocks sort of, they have a symbolic capacity that's way beyond words. Yeah.
Well, they are ancient by definition as well. So, which is, I don't know what other
And they'll be allowed.
what other things you can really easily hold in your hand that have representation of age. Actually, it's quite interesting. Not many things, really. You know, obviously metals and stuff, but rocks are everywhere. You know, I can go down a stream, and yeah, interesting.
And they've been around a long while before we came,
Yeah.
and they'll be around a long while after we go.
Once you're lying in your coffin table, which is maybe a good parting end to our. We've done about an hour and a half, which is good. So I don't know if there's anything I didn't ask you to talk about. We could probably talk for another 2 hours. We won't do, but is there anything I didn't ask you wanted to share, apart from maybe some details where people can follow you? Anything else?
Look, no, I'm happy that we've just had a fun conversation.
Awesome, mate. Yeah, well, I've enjoyed catching up, and
It's
good to
fun
see you
for a
looking well.
while.
We want to be free to do what we want to
Two were
do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barker, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095.